Hey everyone, it's Hazmat Lorcana here, and with it being the week of Birmingham and Vegas, I thought we should probably do a little bit of a cram sesh and take a look at all the decks over the weekend that did well. There were 3 massive events over the weekend, 2 of which had over 100 players, and 1 of which had over 200 players. So let's take a look at the winning decks of each of those events, and some that I've highlighted as well. Oh, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. Thank you very much. We'll start off strong with the tournament that had 241 players, and that was of course the Lyon Cup. And if you weren't already convinced that Ruby Sapphire and Steelsong will be the most prominent decks at the challenge events, then take a look at the split from this event. Yeah. It's pretty damning. Not to mention that in the top 8 alone there was 4 Ruby Sapphire decks and 2 Steelsong decks. But the winner of the event was Q. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, on what is titled as a red-blue classic, but is definitely a Sisu on ice. Perhaps that's just the new classic. It's very much the standard Sisu on ice build at the moment that we see here, with perhaps 1 extra ice block than you'd usually see. But since ice block is so imperative to this deck's strategy, I think that's a reasonable shout. There was a time where this deck stopped running 1 jump aheads and how far out goes, but they're certainly back in force, so perhaps your turn 2 Ursula won't be that useless. The deck's only running 1 Be Prepared, so against the more high-end decks this might struggle a little bit, but with most of the popular decks in the format, Steelsong, Green Purple, they're all pretty low to the ground in terms of their strength, so Sisu will hit most of them. And so here's another deck that I wanted to highlight from that tournament, and that is a Blue Steel deck that made it into the top 4, piloted by Sebastian Montelet. This is very much your standard Blue Steel ramp into either the big Tamatoa or a Mufasa. It includes 3 hideaways to deal with your opponent's dimes or queen's castles, and plenty of songs as well. And speaking of which, this runs 3 Whole New Worlds. Now there are some versions of Blue Steel that don't run Whole New Worlds. I personally am a Whole New World enjoyer, so this deck speaks more to me than the others. 3 copies of Pete, Games Referee, will help you see out the game by disabling your opponent from playing any actions whatsoever to stop you. A tool which Red-Blue doesn't have access to. But yeah, I wanted to point it out because you don't see many Blue Steels in the top cut of tournaments these days. So it was fantastic to see Sebastian giving it some glory it deserves. Another deck from the top 4 that I wanted to highlight was a Blurple deck, and that's blue-purple if you weren't sure. And I actually said in my previous video to watch out for this deck. I think it's incredibly strong. Can sometimes fall down to the hyper-aggressive decks, but we're not seeing as many of those as I thought we would. But yeah, this deck has bounce tools, ramp tools, bounce tools to play those ramp tools again. Then it just throws out freeze mechanics in the big Elsa Spirit of Winter to lock your opponents out of the game. Just remember that they'll probably just bounce this back and replay it over and over again. And you, my friend, will not be allowed to play the game. This deck also includes 2 copies of Mufasa, which honestly, if this deck ever gets both Elsa and Mufasa out on the field, I think you should just scoop. But yeah, this deck has a lot of potential, it just takes a little while to get going. So it is very punishable by aggressive decks, and Steelsong as well is probably going to give it a rough time, which in the current state of the meta isn't ideal for it, which is likely why we're not seeing it make that top cut too often. But yeah, fantastic seeing it get some love here, and especially after I mentioned it in the last video, it was certainly nice to see it pop up. Moving on to the next tournament, and it was the Summer League tournament over in Italy with 108 players. This tournament's top cut also featured mostly Ruby, Sapphire and Steelsong, but in this case wasn't topped by them. Oh no. It was Green Purple, of course. Yes, the old Amethyst Emerald Toolbox deck piloted by Michele here. The noticeable difference is that he's dropped the Chromacon, the Queen's Castle and the Arna in favour for fleshing out some of the numbers of the other characters. For example, an extra Sir Hiss and an extra Kit Cloud Kicker. Honestly, this deck surprised a lot of us, and I would expect to see this as perhaps the 3rd most represented deck at the challenge events, maybe very closely tied with Ruby Amethyst. The deck that came second was a Lemon and Lime discard deck piloted by Giovanni. This is a very classic Lemon and Lime discard deck, with 2 Lucifers as well that will make your opponent discard 2 cards or 1 action from their hand, and the Muses, which allow you to bounce Lucifer back and just replay him again. And as we all know, the combination of Kida into Under the Sea is just disgusting and really feels quite horrible to have played against you. Hidden Cove's essential in this deck to stop it getting overrun by Ruby Sapphire decks, and Cricky allows the deck to have a little bit more punch where it would usually be lacking very much. Moving on to a deck that I wanted to highlight from this tournament, and that is actually a Amber Ruby Mufasa deck that managed to make it into the top 16. And there are actually two of this deck that made it into the top 16. And I say two of this deck because they were pretty much identical, except for maybe one card different. Honestly, I think this deck is such a slept on deck. It is very hard to deal with, both for Steelsong and Ruby Sapphire. Steelsong very much struggles to damage most of the stat lines in this deck, whilst Ruby Sapphire decks, since they're running less Be Prepareds, struggle to do much about the characters with such high strength. It may struggle sometimes to Emerald Amethyst, and if a Steelsong is playing a particularly aggressive build, it may struggle against that as well. But honestly, I think it's pretty well rounded, and in the current state of the meta, actually an okay pick. You won't see many of these at the challenge events, but if you do come across one, expect it to be a good game. And the last tournament I wanted to have a look at was the 1.6k pre-challenge event out in Belgium, with a total of 69 players. Steelsong actually took the top 2 spots in this tournament, with the number 1 deck being piloted by Christoph. This deck is almost a like-for-like version of Brendan DeCandio's deck that won the CSS 10k tournament, except it cuts back on a Prince Naveen and a Pete to make room for 2 copies of I Find My Platinum, which is an excellent call into a meta where the mirror matches are probably running lanterns as well, and the other deck you're going to be facing a lot of is Ruby Sapphire, which runs a lot of items. There's not too much more to say about this deck since a lot's been said about it already. It's a fantastic deck and there's a reason that it won that 10k show. And yes, a lot of that could just be because it's Brendan DeCandio playing it, but there's no denying it must be a pretty solid deck even with that considered. And the deck that I wanted to highlight from this event could not have made me happier. It's an Emerald Steel deck. Emerald Steel are the colours that are truest to my heart, and so I absolutely love that somebody's made the top 8 of a tournament with one. This deck is very much a discard deck that utilises both Prince John and Diablo as draw power. What I am surprised to not see is Ursula Deceiver of All, but the 3-drop slot is pretty heavily occupied, so perhaps I understand why she didn't make the cut. However, I do think being able to double sing songs such as Sudden Chill and Let the Storm Rage On, it's just so strong. 3 copies of Arna, which I'm a massive fan of, just due to her versatility. You can use her to discard a card, to buff one of your own characters, or to banish a damaged character. And on top of that, she still is going to quest for 2 after you've done. 2 copies of Hidden Cove, much like the Lemon Lime deck we looked at earlier, to simply keep things out of Ruby Sapphire's range. And this deck is also running 2 copies of I Find My Platinum, a card which is certainly gaining a lot of popularity in this last couple of weeks. And that's all the decks that I wanted to highlight. I hope you've all locked in your decks for the challenge event this weekend. I would highly advise against changing at this point. You want to make sure that you're getting as many reps in as you can on the deck that you've chosen, so that you're familiar with every card in that deck. I wish everybody watching right now the best of luck, and I hope that the cards are in your favour. Of course, if you are going to the Birmingham event and you do happen to see me, then make sure you say hi. But other than that, I've been Hazmat Lorcana, you've been you guys, and have a great weekend.